This is AI Goes to College, a new podcast about artificial intelligence in higher education and beyond. Welcome to the second episode of AI Goes to College, where we explore the intersection between artificial intelligence and higher education. I'm your host, Professor Sarah Stuart, and today we're going to be talking to a very special guest about customized learning in higher ed. So things like adaptive assessments and tailor-made content for students, possibly way more engagement than the traditional classroom can provide. So we're going to talk to our guest today. Welcome, Jason Gulya. So Jason is a professor of English and applied media. He's an AI consultant for colleges and the author of the AI Adventure newsletter. So thank you for joining us today, Jason.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm so excited to get to talk to you and think about education, AI, personalization, everything else.
Yeah, I find it so fascinating, just the idea of customizing education. But let's start with a little background about yourself. I know that you are a professor as well, but you've been doing so much in the AI space lately. So I want to know, as a professor of English, how do you start as a professor of English and become a global leader in AI? How does that happen?
So it's been a very strange process. And one of the things that I really try to emphasize is that I'm not an expert in AI. I wasn't trained in AI. I'm an English professor. I teach humanities. I teach writing. My PhD is actually in 18th century British literature, which seems very far afield, although I actually think is that I think about AI more and writing more and literature more. There are like these weird connections between them. But really the way that I got into it was through horror. The first time I used ChatGPT, I was absolutely horrified. I was so worried about it. I remember just using it for half an hour, and just becoming more and more depressed by it and just seeing what this program can do. And I actually turned to my wife, who was sitting on the other side of the table, and I said to her that the worst thing just happened. I just found the future of plagiarism. And it was so bad that I actually put the program completely aside for a few weeks. And I went back to it. And I tried to think about it as a learner. I tried to just say, I'm not going to think about it as a professor. I'm not going to worry about, the writing part. Just going to kind of table that. I'm just going to think about what I can teach myself. And that's when things started to shift for me. And that's kind of where it all began. And I think that writers and writing instructors, a lot of us have these like feeling of angst and these almost existential worries, which I totally get. And further experimentation and sharing on social media has really been my way of kind of working through it. Whenever I write on LinkedIn or any platform that I'm active on, I try to use the writing process and the sharing process as a way to figure it out. And that once I started doing that enough, once I really just kind of committed to that in all of its weirdness, that's where things started to change, because I think that so many of us, especially early on, fell victim to the idea that everyone wanted to learn from experts. And I actually don't think that's what happened. I think what really happened was that we recognized, so many of us, that we were all trying to figure this technology out. And we still are. We're trying to figure out how it works. We're trying to figure out how to work it into education, if we should work it into education. And being kind of open on social media has helped me out, just in a reflective way, but also in just like bringing other people along, because I think that there is this kind of thirst for just watching people experiment with it and figuring out what the larger issues are, what the big picture stuff are. So that's kind of how it happened. It went from that kind of moment of horror and worry to just a commitment to sharing, because I felt like that's how I needed to figure things out. And then things just kind of snowballed from there. And I'm still constantly learning. I'm constantly playing with things. I don't feel like I'm actually much closer to being an expert. I feel like it's just an ongoing process of learning and sharing.
Well, it changes so much. It feels like, how can anybody be an expert at this point? It's so young, it's so new. And just like we were talking about before we started recording, it's interesting, you're like, oh, well, it's still around. You can't believe we're still talking about it. But really, we're just kind of going through the same growing pains, I think, that we went through with the dawn of the internet. So there's
Yeah,
a
and
lot,
I think
gonna be
that
a lot of people
oh,
are going
sorry, go
to
ahead.
need a lot of people are going to need your expertise
Yeah,
for
I
many
think that
years.
that cyclical part is so important. I think that there is this narrative of disruption, this narrative of it's going to change everything. And sometimes I think it is good and I think that it is accurate. And other times I think not so much, right? People coming in and saying, this is the biggest thing ever that's been invented. It's bigger than fire. All of that rhetoric is certainly out there. And I think that one of the things we miss is that there's actually a lot that is the same, right? There's something that is cyclical about this technology. A lot of the things, a lot of the questions, worries that are now bubbling over the surface have been happening for a while, right? They're
Mhm.
part of these larger changes, right? This isn't something that came out of nowhere. And that's one of the reasons that, I continue to go back. I know it's my training, but I think it's helpful. I go back to the Enlightenment. I go back and I think about what happened when these supposed scientific upheavals were happening and suddenly people were being asked to think in different ways, right? And I think that there's actually some continuity with what is happening
Mhm.
now,
Mhm.
in terms of thinking about the paradigm shift, if there is a paradigm shift, and how we can figure things out as we go along, and also just what's happening emotionally. I
Mhm.
think that one of the best things we can do is, as we are responding to the advancements in this technology, think about why we're responding in certain ways. Because again, that's something that, this is about bubbling to the surface. It's not about doing much new. And I think thinking about it in a historical way has really helped me, in both kind of a comforting way, but also in kind of just in a way that helped me figure things out. So I can
Mhm.
say that, well, these are kind of a lot of what we're dealing with are things that have been in the background for 100+ years. And now we're suddenly seeing this technology get to a point where we have to deal with them. And I continually find it interesting to go back to fiction and go back to literature and go back to stories that have been
Mhm.
around for a really long time about robots and alien intelligences and all these
Mhm.
different things, and just figuring out how they're all, not even figuring out, but thinking about how they could be connected is so
Mhm.
interesting and exciting. And I think exactly what we should be doing.
Yeah. Well, it's good that you didn't stay in that horror phase because I think some faculty are still there. And if you
Yeah.
think about what if you were raised in that period when the printing press came out, right? And you had been trained one way, and of course you'd be horrified by the printing press. So it makes sense that it's taking time for, some of us. It's taking a little bit more time than others. But I want to before we get into finding solutions and talking about customizable education, there's this recent social media post of yours, and it was
Oh,
it was
gosh.
so interesting. I thought it was beautiful, so I wanted to read it aloud if you don't mind. Um,
Yeah, go ahead. I'll just try not to listen for the next 2 seconds.
well, it's about what AI can't do, so I want to kind of start there instead of talking about what it can do. Okay, so this is a LinkedIn social media post that Jason wrote. He wrote, "These activities will never be replaced by AI. Like never, ever. The experience of writing ourselves, word by word, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, and having ideas bubble up as we do. The experience of watching a movie scene by scene with little idea of what is going to happen next. The experience of putting a paintbrush to canvas, making decisions as we go along. The experience of learning to play an instrument through hours and hours and hours of practice and failure. In an era of automation and efficiency, some of life's best experiences defy shortcuts. They are about process, not product." And I feel like, I love that, by the way. I feel like we
Thank you.
talk about that all the time, like at conferences and, within our departments. Well, let's make it about the process and not the product. But you really did a wonderful job here of creating what that means, what that looks like, and bringing the humanity back to it. So do you want to comment on that and the discussions that
Yeah.
maybe bubbled up? Because I saw that there was some, just lots of comments.
Yeah. So that idea kind of came out of watching my kids. So I have a 3-year-old, almost 4-year-old, but I'm going to call him a 3 until the day he turns 4. And then I have a 10-month-old. And I was watching them because we had a visit from my brother and his 2 kids, and just watching them create and do things and spend time on things. Like really sit there for my son, my 3-year-old could sit there for 3 hours and just color. That's it. Just spend that kind of dedicated time to it. And I think that there is this push, this kind of push for a culture of hyper efficiency, just doing things fast. And even when you look online and you read and you listen to how people talk about AI, the thing that sticks out to me more than anything else is that there is this assumption that faster is always better. And in some contexts, that makes sense. But I also think, as a creator and as someone who's really interested in what happens when we dedicate time to something, the human mind takes time. It just does. There's a reason when you look at a painting, something different happens, right? When you stand there and look at it for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, maybe an hour in, right, of just looking at that painting and not anything else, something happens to your mind. And I haven't seen anything to suggest that the technology will change that. And that's something that I actually really worry about. I worry that if this cult of hyper efficiency really, really takes off, that we're going to lose that. And that's losing something about the human condition, right? That's something about just spending time on something or redoing something. There's a reason why I get more out of reading a novel for the 5th time as opposed to the first time. It just has to do with how our neurons fire and how our psychology works. And so I thought a lot about that, and even just like, what do and I think other people find interesting about watching a human create things. And I immediately, after I kind of shared that, I returned to the idea in my newsletter, and I thought a lot about Bob Ross because he's kind of the big one that came into my mind. And I thought about, why do I like watching him? Like, legitimately, why is he interesting? And I mean, because as a tutorial, they're awful, right? If you ever tried to paint along them, it's not a tutorial, right? It doesn't work that way. I doubt anyone, unless you're like a really experienced painter, can do that. And then you're probably not watching Bob Ross videos if you're an experienced painter. Right. And if I just had a machine do it, I don't think it'd be interesting then. But there's something about watching him really like he has obviously a plan in place and has done it before, but there's something about how he's responding to it that is interesting, right? And I think I thought a lot about it in terms of like art, and it just takes time. And I think that, going forward, we're gonna have to figure out how to preserve that, because I think that is so important, and it's so important for the classroom too. And there are all these ideas about using AI to, for example, generate a first draft. Right. And Leon Furtz has written about this too. So he calls it the myth of the first draft. And the basic idea is that it's very tempting. Right? When ChatGPT came out, within a few months, you saw people, typically who are not educators, who were talking about how awesome it would be for a student to, say, have a topic, have an essay they're going to write, have an AI program create the first draft, and then the student just revises it. That's it. They move things around. Maybe they get rid of some paragraphs. They add something here, subtract something there, and then they have a finished product. And that was thrown out there as this kind of awesome use case. In my opinion, it is a terrible use case for most people, right? For some of us, that's very attractive because we can offload that. But we need that moment of creating as a way to figure things out. I would never offload writing my first draft to AI because I need the writing process. I need to literally, sometimes I do this by writing by hand. I need to create the idea sentence by sentence by sentence, because when we do that, something happens to the mind in the same way that, painting does. So you just need that process, and you can't shortcut it, right? You can't just get rid of bits and pieces of it. We might need that process to think writing is about thinking. Painting, I would say, is about thinking. That's actually what's kind of interesting about it. Watching someone create it, that, Bob Ross does something and it doesn't turn out exactly as he plans, right? It doesn't matter. He can do it 1,000 times. There's still going to be surprises built into his process. And he responds to it. Yeah. And I also thought a lot about Jackson Pollock. So the cool thing about him is that he would literally just take the canvases, put them on the floor, and he would drip paint, right? He would just have, also had machines, he'd do it later, that, he would interact with. But he would literally just hold the paintbrush that was dripped with, just dipped in paint, and he would just splatter it, right? He'd either put it forcefully or he'd just let it drip. And depending on what happened, he'd have to respond in a split second. He couldn't afford to not be a part of the process. If he was checked out, if he was thinking about something else, you would know immediately. Because if he responded a split second later, it would change the painting and it would look awful. And he needed to be in that moment. And, I think that, we need to preserve that, especially in the process. But that's kind of, and that, I think that some people agree with that and some people didn't. I think, in the comments on the LinkedIn, there was a little bit of tension there, which I think is fine. I think, there's going to be tension built into this. And some ways the tension is kind of the point. But I think that, and this will be kind of my wrapping up idea, that if anyone sees something emerging with this technology, right? For me, it's that cult of hyper efficiency. And we want to push against, we should push against it. Yeah. I don't believe in this inevitability argument. I don't believe that, AI is going to change everything and there's nothing we can do about it. I think that we have a lot of agency. And that post is kind of, my little way to kind of push against it and just say, well, we also have this thing. And I'm not convinced that AI will ever get close to replicating it in any sort of way.
Yeah. When you have that kinesthetic part of it that you're talking about when you're talking about painting, so I think it's easier than maybe talking about writing. But I love that Bob Ross. I think I'm going to bring that. I'm going to do a conference. I'm going to do a paper and I'm going to make them watch a Bob Ross video for 20 minutes, so I can make a point about process over product. But I like the cult of hyper efficiency. Yeah, I think that's a problem. Yeah, that can be, because it's you want that for things that the AI is good at, but we want to be able to preserve the things that we're doing, especially when it comes to embodying something like writing, writing things out. I don't know if you remember the text writing on both sides of the brain. But it's a writing text, and one of the activities is write by hand, because that, activates certain parts of your brain. And so I try to have students do that when we have in-person classes. But yeah, I love that post. So I'll probably put that in the show notes.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Just for fun, real quick. What's one thing you wish AI could do that it cannot do yet?
I wish AI. I spent some time thinking about this question or seeing when you sent it to me. I was going back and forth, because any sort of answer immediately became dystopic very, very quickly. That's always the issues with this technology. I think from an instructor's perspective, and I'm sure people are building this, I haven't seen anything that's even close to thinking about it. I wish that there were an AI program that is actually useful for thinking about models of education. When you go on, you look at all these programs, and I would say 90% of them, even if they're ed tech AI programs, actually don't have a very good pedagogy established. They actually haven't really thought about what it means to reach a student. And so I even think having the ability to have, an AI program that was actually decent at thinking about models of education, right? Whatever it is, it can be Gagne's 9 events of instruction. It can be principles of interactive learning, whatever, but something that is a little bit less than generic. And I really haven't seen anything that's close to this. And I'll actually give another one. The other thing that I hope emerges, because one of the things that worries me, and this is one of the ideas in the background when I wrote that LinkedIn post, was reading and close reading. How do you convince a student to say spend 5 hours or whatever time we think is useful for something, 5 hours, say, thinking about a quote? right? Just like really getting close to it, rethinking it, looking at it from different angles, thinking about different frameworks and applying them, right? Doing that. How do you convince that? How do you, in this new kind of culture of hyper efficiency, how do you get them to do that? And part of me wants to just say that's going to be a non-AI thing. But part of me does want to see an AI program that actually is going to help with that. The vast majority of reading programs don't actually help students read.
Yeah.
And we actually saw one of the more prominent examples I can think of is Conmigo. So Conmigo, when it came out and they, revealed it, and they showed a couple of demos. And I've written about this too. They show Conmigo helping a student quote unquote read. So they have a text in there. I forget which one it might have been, To Kill a Mockingbird, something like that. They had a text in there. And the student could have an interaction with a chatbot off to the side. And Zal Khan gives his TED talk and says, all right, this is helping them read. Then you pause and you take a look at it, and it wasn't, not at all, right?
Really?
So the chatbot was, say, pretending to be a character.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
And they interact with it. That's not reading, right? And we're seeing a lot of that. And that's actually, there's something that comes from. I think that a lot of our students, a lot of my students, approach, say, a story as an informational text, right? That it's about extracting information. There's so many reasons so many places where this comes from. But if you try that for reading, that does not work for the vast majority of things. Reading isn't about simply extracting information. It's that experience of reading, right?
Yeah.
So a student can interact with that. And yes, they might get the content, right? They might be able to say, I understand this about Boo Radley or Scout or whoever. I think it was Kill a Mockingbird. I'm not sure. But whoever the characters are, maybe it was Great Gatsby, actually. Anyway, doesn't matter. So they'd be able to interact with it and understand some of those characters. But did they actually develop the skill of reading?
Right. Yeah.
And no, they didn't.
Yeah.
It's totally different. It's thinking about content.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a problem. This is I would say a fallacy that happens across the board. That's why I focus on process so much, partially because I think it's what ed tech companies are missing. Like, they're not actually valuing the reading process. They're valuing what that student can produce, or they're valuing what kind of information they can extract. They're not valuing the process of creating something, sentence by sentence or whatever it is, or reading something word by word by word. I think that's going to be continue to be valuable. And actually going forward, I would say it might actually be a differentiator. So I do wish that there were, and I know people are working on it, but I've never seen anything close to it, a program that actually helps students read, right? And make sense of a text, right? I remember Microsoft, they unveiled theirs too, right? Microsoft had or still has a reading program, right? A reading AI program. It's the worst AI program I've ever seen.
Really?
It's awful. It's so bad. All it does is it gives you a text. It can personalize the text for you. So you can say, I am Jason. I want a story about bunnies that want to be dogs, right? Like whatever it is, you can feed it to it and it'll generate for you, which anyone who uses technology knows that's the easy part. That's simple, right? That's just simple prompting. And then you read it out loud and the AI will flag you when you're struggling. Sounds really interesting until you realize that if you actually know how to read, you're not reading in monotone. So what I just did when I slowed down, it would say I'm struggling to speak. So for example, it flagged me when I said Jason because I changed my reading pace, because that's what I will naturally do depending on the sentence and the paragraph. It's just embedded in how I read. And it's just like, for me, that's no big deal, right? I'm 37. I have all this confidence. And I was like, all right, so obviously it missed the mark here. But if I were, say, 8 and suddenly this program is telling me I'm reading wrong, but then I realize I'll do really well if I simply speak like a robot and suddenly I'll get perfect marks. Well, suddenly I'm going to talk that way. That's exactly what we don't want it to do.
Yeah.
So that's a long kind of diatribe, but I think that there is such a gap
Mm-hmm.
between when AI programs are actually helping students read better, or if there's something else that's happening, whether it's just
Mm-hmm.
on content or focusing on reading out loud, which even that, it's not really the only thing we should be reading when it comes to teaching when it comes to reading. But there's such a gap between pedagogy and what a lot of the ed tech companies are doing
Mm-hmm.
with their programs.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm hearing you say like not only process, but experience, right? The experience of reading it. Yeah, that is something that AI can't really do. And that's maybe where we can focus, right? We can
Yeah.
focus our teachers and we can take these other programs, which I'm going to ask about later, like tools, perhaps, certain websites that you think can help. But first, I want to jump to the question about just kind of helping our faculty here at FSCJ, especially in this department. So, in communication, they're struggling right now because it's the end of the semester and we're going into another semester with the barrage of AI generated essays, right? And so, if you could just give kind of for a faculty member who's maybe not who's kind of new to AI, but they know that this is AI generated stuff. How should we handle it now? And maybe how should we handle it going forward? Because I know those are two different things, because right now it's hitting us pretty hard and we're at all different levels.
Yeah. And I think one of the best things we can do is to resist the temptation to figure it out all at once. I think that it's very tempting to say, I'm going to take the next couple of weeks and I'm going to figure out how to create AI proof assessments. And you can find people who've written about that and give trainings on that. My personal recommendation is to not do that. First of all, I would say that don't even worry about the AI proofing, right? Just kind of push that aside as an idea. I would say step number one, and it sounds so obvious, talk to your students. Really, honestly, talk to them about it. And there are so many different ways that you can do this. One way, if depending on faculty, if you have the flexibility, ask students to create an AI policy with you. So that's just one way. And again, that's depending on institution. Some people can do it, some people cannot. Totally get that as a limitation. But if you can create an AI policy with your students, that immediately causes buy-in. And another thing you can do is empathy exercises. I think that empathy is going to be so key. And it is okay, in my mind, if you're talking to students, to try to take each other's position. Right. So I think it's okay to say to a student, say you're a professor, right? Just imagine you're a teacher, you're a professor, and you're teaching blank. And you create an assignment, right? It's totally you, and you're really excited for your students to tackle it and think about it. How do you feel when you start reading papers and they feel AI generated, right? I think that's okay as an exercise. And the flip side too, right? Say you're a student and you're taking 5 courses and suddenly you get the sense that your teacher gives you a paper that you don't care about.
Yeah.
How would that make you feel? I think that's okay too. I think those empathy exercises, once we have them and get in the practice of doing them regularly, I think that really matters. And I think it's okay to do that. I think it's okay to say, students, take my position, I will take your position, and you just do that and you have a back and forth, right? No, you're not going to completely understand what it's going to be like to be a student, and they're not going to completely understand what it's like to be you. But having that experience again of putting yourself in their place and vice versa, I think changes things. And take it as a jumping off point for open conversation. And before that happens, I don't think anything else can happen.
Okay.
And so that would be my short-term idea. And my long-term idea, and this is something I'm working on now, and it takes some work. And if anyone does want to reach out to me, I am happy to send, what I've done already. But trying to find ways to make the process visible. Again, I think that as we go forward, I know we mentioned this already, I think that so much of assessment is going to be less about the product, right? Which it was traditionally. Hand me a paper, I'll read it, I'll grade it, give you feedback, all that stuff, but more about the process of
Mm-hmm.
it. So, and I actually did an experiment with this, and I'll try to make this concrete. So, for my literature class, which finished a couple weeks ago, I used to have this pretty traditional set of essay assignments. So students might have, say, 4 stories. I would let them choose one. I'd give them, some options they can deal with, or I'd let them create their own. And so for me,
Mm-hmm.
it was about student agency and everything, but it was all very product oriented. Right?
Mm-hmm.
I had a rough draft, but did that really make its way into the grading? Not so much. It was a chance to kind of give feedback. And yeah, I wanted to see them work that feedback in, but it was so sort of clunky. So what I ended up doing was I got rid of the final paper. I just deleted it. And I instead created a kind of revised portfolio assignment.
Mm-hmm.
So I gave them a Word document and it has stages in it, right? So stage 1, say your name, whatever it was. It's kind of a throwaway stage.
Mm-hmm.
Stage number 2, right? Once you choose a story, free write, right? 5 minutes, free write. And I had it in the document. So I had it set off in red font. So instructions, it said, when you find red font, that's where you fill in your answer. And so from there, it becomes painfully obvious if a student used AI. These sections should have a bunch of grammatical mistakes.
Right.
They should have, that's fine. And I'm very, very honest. I want it to be messy. I want you to give 5 minutes. And this was me flipping the script. So I talked about the myth of the first draft. So what I want to do is I want to push AI into its corner. And I want students to just spend the beginning of this assignment just getting their ideas out. Then I have them choose a passage. A lot of my students want to skip this, right? But it's all process oriented. I want students to choose a passage, paragraph or 2, not a bunch. Just put it there, just copy and paste it. And on Microsoft Word, write comments, annotate it. And quantity over quality. I just want number of ideas generated. Right? I'm not super worried about whether they're insightful, anything like that, but just getting students to embrace failure, right? Embrace to say, oh, maybe this worked, maybe this didn't work. And this is all part of process-oriented assessment, I think, and walking them through, and then eventually, creating an argument. And a lot of us have done things like this before. It was just all worked into a single document so I could look at it all in one spot. Whereas if you put it in an LMS and a learning management system, it splinters it up, it breaks it up, right? I want to see it all. And for one of them, students have kind of a list of potential arguments, and I gave them a contrarian chatbot. So I created it through ChatGPT, gave it to them. They went in, and in the prompt, I asked the chatbot to just push against their argument, right? Focus on the possible pitfalls in their logic, or basically creating a debate. And I had students just copy and paste the whole chat. Right? Just give me the link, and they put that in the document. And that's where I kind of show, this is one of the ways that AI could actually help. And then going from there, just kind of building. And so at the end, I had this document that lets me learn about not just how the student writes. Because a lot of students, when they get to college, many of them, not all of them, have learned how to fake writing an essay.
Yeah.
Right? They've learned how to fake the process and just make the product look okay. They've learned how to kind of jump that. And so this is one way of, one experiment of me trying to make the process visible. And I grade, right, how they're working with the chatbot, right? And I walk them through, did they let the chatbot take over? Right? Did they use the chatbot to help themselves out as opposed to vice versa? Those sort of things. And so that's all built into the assessment. I give them feedback and all that sort of stuff. Because I think that's where I kind of see my assessments moving, right? Things like that. And again, I got there gradually over time. It took me really about a year of playing with this technology and thinking about it, say, oh, I think that's what I want to try. And it works reasonably well. And I learned so much by reading them, much more than I did from reading a traditional paper. So So that's where I see myself going. Some people might work depending on discipline, some people might not. But I think that starting with students and having open conversations with them is step number one. And then from there, I would say thinking about process over product.
Well, I mean, it seems like that we're getting to that place where that we wanted to talk about is that this is a truly customized assignment because they get to talk about the passage with someone else, before they talk about it with you. They get to get that feedback. So you're already customizing it. And I'm sure that they're getting, if they're doing it right, they're getting a lot more chat time, right, than they ever would with you, than they ever would, with a teacher. So depending on the assignment, I know it takes a lot of time to change our ways, depending on the department that we're talking about. But yeah, I think this is a really good way to get students to not only, work with ChatGPT and other artificial intelligence, but also get that customized feedback. It also strikes me that free writing, actually doing free writing, does probably take some vulnerability, I think, from the students. So it seems like you'd have to have a classroom where they truly feel okay to really free write in a way that where all the mistakes are in there. Because I think that's a place where you want to be transparent. You want to have a really good relationship with your students. That's a piece of it that I think sometimes we miss when we talk about technology and education.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of it too depends on the method of instruction. I think that when you read online and there are all these posts and ideas about incorporating AI into education, and one of the things that I'm constantly asking is, was this built for in-person classes? Was this built for online classes or hybrid class? And I think it's painfully obvious. I would say the vast majority of them, almost all of them, are built for in-person experiences, right? All these ideas about defending an idea orally or having a debate that showcases the ideas, right? You kind of push back and say, yeah, but what about that asynchronous online class? That you could do it, but I don't think it's quite as meaningful as an in-person experience. That I think one of the one of the hardest questions out there is how to make process visible in an online asynchronous course. That's really hard. I think it's not easy in an in-person class, but you have so many resources available to you that are suddenly off the shelf, right? You can't, and so many institutions are like this when you can't even ask students to come into a Zoom, right? Because they're developed to be totally worked around the students' schedule and whatever time they have. So you can't just say, show up Wednesday at 4 o'clock and we'll have a Zoom. You can't do that. And suddenly all these resources go away. And more students are taking classes that way. And I think that if we leave them out of the conversation, we're going to lose those students. And as that becomes a growing sector, I think it'll be ever growing for the foreseeable future. Can't lose those students. We have to make it as accessible for as many students as possible. And that might mean online asynchronous experiences, which, are really hard. They're really hard to have that kind of community and have that focus on process. But I think that we have to try. We have to try and test it out and just kind of go from there.
Yeah, I think online async, and I teach those, some of them, they are they can be the problem, and I know that, they can be really, like for me, I mean, it's definitely makes sense to not have that commute. And, sometimes I just need them for my schedule, but yeah, they can be a problem.
Yeah.
I want to really, let's talk about kind of the future and the most optimistic side of things when it comes to customized learning. What do you think? And I did mention Sal Khan in my notes here that I shared with you, because I remember getting excited when I first heard some of his talks about education and AI. But what are some best case scenarios for personalized learning, like taking this to the next level? What are some things that you think are on the horizon or that we've already seen that are really going to kind of change the game?
Yeah, so I do think, despite my disagreements with Sal Khan, which is fine. He's famous. I am not. But, so I mean, so much. I do think that there's a lot that can come out of personalization, and I do think that, especially now, there's this recognition that the one size fits all model hasn't worked. The idea that you stand there, you give a lecture, watch a video, have students do an assessment, right? We know that this doesn't work. And it's not new, right? AI didn't break this. We've known that this hasn't worked for decades and decades and
Right.
decades. It's not based off of the research into learning and learning science. And so I do think there are a couple of big things that can come out of customized learning. I think a big one is going to be gamification. I think gamified learning, if it's done properly and in a context that makes sense, is set to become much, much better. And I'll be totally honest, I never liked gamified learning. I never found it engaging.
I'm with you.
I never got it. It never made sense to me.
Yeah.
And I would watch like experts, people who are really, really, really like committed to it and really good at it. And they would, have this game that, would flow pretty well and would make sense and people would learn. And, they would come back and say, something like, oh, did you see how engaging that was? And sometimes I would tell them the game wasn't engaging. I'm sorry. And this is the one size fits all, right? Games don't work for everyone. There are some students who actually don't want gamified learning. And one of the culprits, I think, and it really came down to, I sort of started to recognize this with AI. One of the reasons that gamified learning never really works for me is that it was never really personalized, right? It sort of was. There was this kind of veneer of personalization, but it was still based off of a template. It was still based off of these preconceived things that I was going to do and then it was going to do and other people are going to do. So it never was that engaging for me. Now, for students that gamified learning works really well for, I think AI is going to be huge. I think it's going to be a really powerful improvement, right? That students can actually now, and obviously we need to think a lot about hallucinations, improper, messages that could happen, and everything like that. But if we're able to rein it in, I think that could be huge.
Yeah. And
also just thinking about that zone of zone of proximal achievement. Yeah. So, and for a lot of us, so trying to figure out, where a student is and how to kind of nudge them without losing them. I think that AI and customized learning experience, I think the only way to do this is going to be the way that happens. Because it's really hard. If you have 10 students, yeah, you can do it. If you have 100 students, that is really, really difficult. That is a huge push. You'd have to teach more than 24/7, right? You don't have the time to do that, right? Especially if you're doing everything else, right? If you're working at a college, you're not just teaching, you're doing administrative stuff, you're doing all these other things that need to get done. And so you just can't do it. And so that's the kind of stuff that it's really, really useful for. Now, my hope is within the next 5 years, we move past customized learning. Now, I don't mean that we get rid of it. I mean that I think for the foreseeable future, for the next few years at least, we're going to really focus on customizing and personalizing lessons as much as possible. But then what I want to see reintroduced is really a focus on social learning. Because personalized learning, if we just invest entirely in that, that's actually pretty limited. I think that it can be isolating, and there are all these problems that come out of it. And so it's going to be about thinking about personalized learning in a larger ecosystem of learning, right? And that gets you to the social aspect. Now you can get at that sort of with gamification and other ways of personalized learning, but it really comes down to, thinking about learning in a social context. That's what I think, thinking about something like an AI chatbot, right? An AI tutor. This is something that Sal Khan has put out there as like this huge game changer in technology. That's why I think it won't be. I think it'll help a lot of students. Although even Sal Khan admits that there are many students that it will not work for, right? If you sat me in front of a computer, I was 10 years old, and you sat me in front of a computer and said, here's an AI tutor, that would be a colossal failure. Like
Really?
it would not work. That would not work for 10-year-old me. Maybe
Mhm.
10-year-olds now are different. But I would not have found that engaging at all. I
Right.
still don't.
Yeah.
And so and one of the reasons I think they'll be a little limited is that it's so hard to get them at that social learning part.
Mhm.
Right? Maybe they just can't do it. Right? Maybe there's a replacement for that kind of social push.
Right.
And there are ways to balance them, but I don't think we're there yet. I think right now we're just on the personalization part. But what I'm hoping is that at some point we'll get to think about that in a larger context, because that's when I think things get interesting.
Mhm.
Um, and it's a mixing of different kinds of learning, different kinds of teaching. And that's when I think the student becomes really, really well served, because one size doesn't fit all, which means personalization doesn't fit all, right? That's also a one size fits all solution, right? It's kind of
Mhm.
a weird one, right?
Yeah.
Because you can adapt it, but it still is. And there are some students that will not find personalized learning interesting, and then many more will. And there's nothing wrong either way.
So maybe we're looking at a future where every child comes to school with his his or her AI mentor, right? And can interact socially with that personalized, kind of like with that teacher by their side, their personal teacher. And
Yeah.
there's
And then
an
it'll be
opportunity to socialize as you learn.
it'll be a matter of customizing that, and then also reining that in. I do think that AI is going to continue to be really, really important and be worked into so many different things, and it's going to be probably even more pervasive than we can even conceptualize right now.
Yeah.
Right, ways that can be worked into society which we don't even see yet. I think that's going to happen, but I also think it's going to happen is we are going to see if we push this value in non-AI spaces. I think
Mm-hmm.
we're seeing that with cell phones,
Mm-hmm.
right? Not that they're totally linked, right? But now you have this push for a lot of schools, parents, students, for these non-cell phone spaces, right? These non-tech spaces. I think there is going to be a value in that. And it's all about having it connect together, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you want. And this is why I start with free writing, right? There are some things that I still think free writing will be valuable 20 years from now. Right.
Mm-hmm.
It may not be like economically valuable, but
Mm-hmm.
as an experience, I still think it's going to be personally valuable. I will do it. I know, my kids will do it. I do think that there's going to be this value in it. And then it's just a matter of connecting it to everything else as much as we can.
Mm-hmm.
And you're right. I think AI tutors, AI mentors are going to be a huge part of that. And it might be multiple ones too, right? The students might have a bunch of different mentors and agents that they use on a regular basis,
Mm-hmm.
to the extent that they don't even think about it anymore. It's just become a part of their everyday lives and the way that they process.
Yeah.
So yeah, but I like many people can't quite conceptualize that yet.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
try to.
I wonder how this can how this will affect the future classroom, especially at the higher ed level, because that's what we're talking about. But like in college classrooms that are diverse in many different ways, it could be different learning disabilities perhaps are in your classroom, different languages, different backgrounds. So I know that's a big lump, a lot of different factors. But how could this maybe help students who are either struggling in different ways, and it could be not just academically, but like emotionally, neurologically, all of the different ways we see kind of diversity in our classrooms. How can AI help?
I think that AI is going to be huge for making learning experiences more accessible. And even for many of us who've been very, very invested in making accessible learning experiences, we have not done a good enough job. Right? That
Mm-hmm.
we know, these universal design learning, all these principles. We go to training, we teach about
Mm-hmm.
them, and then we go and we do not stick to them. We
Yeah.
don't, right? Most of us do not, right? And usually it's just because the behavioral pattern isn't there, right? If we stopped and thought about it, we think, oh, that actually isn't an accessible learning experience, right? And I'm
Mm-hmm.
leaving these students out. And so we go against our own principles. And so when I think of the big use cases for AI is going to be catching those and helping us out with those and making certain things easier to make accessible. So as a very quick example, it used to take so much time to make my videos accessible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It was not that long ago that if I wanted to pop a video in my course, I had to either write a script beforehand and read it, which automatically felt kind of robotic. You can
Mm-hmm.
really sense if the script is written beforehand,
Right.
and I didn't really like it and it didn't feel right. And I think my students didn't feel like it felt right. So either I had to do that or I had to film the video, watch it, type it as I went along, and
Oh my
try to
gosh.
figure out whenever I had a slip up, what do I do? Right? Do I
Mm-hmm.
edit the video? Right, which is going to be another kind of time suck. Or do I find a way to just like clean the transcript, get rid of that, and then in the end, because it was based off of me speaking naturally, the transcript might not make that much sense anyway. And
Right.
so you put all this work in, and it wasn't that much more accessible. Just because
Mm-hmm.
that I felt like having a natural video kind of created this sort of mess of a transcript, or at least messier than I would have liked. So now being able to go into a program, I've done this through Riverside. Microsoft has their own version of doing it too. I can go in and have a video, and it will automatically create actually good transcripts with very, very few errors. And it's just due through AI voice recognition.
Right.
And I mean, that's huge, right? And that is something that legitimately, if I had to do that for a long form video, I don't do them too much anymore, but if I had a long form video I was doing, it might take me 2 to 3 hours.
Yeah.
Now it literally takes 2 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And so what that
Yeah.
allows me to do is it allows me to then have that.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, and this is the case with so many of us, we're all doing 100 different things at once. And we all have very, very little time. And it's all a zero sum game. If I'm spending 10 hours just creating videos that week, that's other things I'm not doing.
Right.
And so now I can keep making videos that are accessible.
Mm-hmm.
And also it makes it, in addition to just creating captions, it allows us to translate content.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of the big things with AI
Yeah,
that I think is very undervalued. There are a lot of people who kind of knock it, right? It's just repurposing content. And one of the reasons that I push against that is that repurposing content is actually extremely valuable.
Mm-hmm.
If I can, say, make a video, just talk to a camera, make a video,
Mm-hmm.
right? Then I can spend literally a minute with an AI program to create a transcript. Then I can spend another minute to turn that into an image. And then I can take another minute to, it's like suddenly, like now we're seeing this multiple levels of instruction, and that's what we want. And we've known that we've wanted that for the last 20 years, but it has been so difficult to actually do that in a practical way. And so, creating those captions and repurposing content are huge and immediate ways to make course content more accessible. And I think that as we go forward and this technology advances more, I think we're going to see more and more use cases with accessibility pop up because a lot, I would say, of learning experiences aren't actually accessible. Even if we know the principles, even if we, say explicitly, yes, I want everyone to be included, it is easier said than done, right? A lot of us, it's not lip service, but it's hard to actually do that. So the technology, I think, will make that significantly easier.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds like some of these solutions are really just kind of behind the scenes technical things that when we talk about AI in the classroom, it doesn't necessarily have to be in the classroom. It can be saving human resource, right? Saving that time and energy to do other things and to do better things and maybe creating more of a social context, which is what teachers do well. Yeah, that's so true. I remember it used to be very difficult to do that kind of thing. And now it's just like that. You have a transcript. Okay, well, we're going to start wrapping up. I just have a couple more questions. One of them is if you have any tools or platforms that you recommend for educators, especially educators who are just kind of dipping their toe into the pool of AI tools at this point, not necessarily anything you promote, but just what are some simple ways to use AI in the way that we just talked about, to save time, to, support faculty?
So I do recommend more than anything else playing with the foundational models. It doesn't have to be anything crazy. I have a kind of revolving door of AI apps that I use, but 80% of the time I'm using the foundational model. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that once you play with these programs, once you play with the models themselves, you start to think a little bit more about what you can create. And if you're looking at an AI product, at an AI program, you're looking at something that's already created, right? It already has limitations built into it. And so I would definitely, for anyone who hasn't played with ChatGPT, right, I'd start there just because there are so many different ways to use it. And also increasingly for educators, I think Claude is becoming very, very popular. And one of the reasons that Claude is so good, I think, for educators is how easy it is to create a prototype of something. So for anyone who, so Claude is created by Anthropic, so they're a competitor to ChatGPT and OpenAI. And so one of the things they did in their recent update is you can ask it to create something, right? Create a game, create whatever it is, and it will create it in a preview window. So if it generates code, it will actually run the code for you, right? And actually give you something and let you see what it's like even before, really committing to it. And when you do that a few times, I think that it starts to get exciting. You start to think about, oh, these are things that I can actually start to create for my students. And so I think that, playing with those two are very, very helpful. And then I do think it's helpful to look at some AI programs just to see what other people have built. One of the ones that I personally like is Gamma. And so this is for creating with AI, obviously, PowerPoint slides and websites and handouts. So there are a couple different ways you can use it. You can either just write a basic prompt and it'll create something. You can also, and this is something they've been updating over the last 6 months to a year, you can upload more and more of your content. So if you have a Word document, something that you want students to cover, or if you have a Word document that's has notes from a conversation with students, you can actually pop it into that program and it will turn into a PowerPoint or it will turn it into a website and you can share it with students. And so again, it's not going to do anything mind blowing, at least, for me, but it is a helpful way to repurpose content. So I can imagine, that it's valuable for having a conversation with students, whether it's through, virtually through Zoom or just in person, running those notes through something like Gamma and having students take a look at it, right? And kind of boil it down. And for me, that's kind of a good use of it because yes, it's sort of repetitious and it's time consuming for a teacher to do, for a professor to do, but it helps students conceptualize things. So that's what I use all the time. And I'm trying to think of others. But I would say, more than anything else, the foundational model. And then think about things that you do every day, things you produce every day, and whether you can automate them. Sometimes you can't.
Yeah.
Right. So for professors, if you're giving feedback, there are a lot of programs that allow you to semi-automate your feedback. I do not. I do not do that. Right. And, once I guess I'll say this more of a caveat than anything else. For anyone who wants to go and play with AI programs, use your own judgment. We're all different in terms of what we want to automate and what we want to keep for ourselves. I like commenting on student work and giving them feedback and going through that assessment. And I find that it makes me closer to them. It lets me learn how they think. And, I could give programs that do that. I won't because I don't want to give them the space, but you can easily find them by Googling them. And I will say that if anyone is not sure if there is an AI program for it, one website I truly, truly recommend is There's an AI for that.
Oh, yeah? There's an AI for that.
There's an AI for that. So you can find it on any search engine. Literally type in the use case, type in whatever you're thinking of doing, lesson planning, assessment, anything, put it in there and it will give you search results that you can just click on and go to. And it's a very quick way to kind of look at what's out there and it also goes through and does much more filtering than if you just do a Google search,
Yeah.
right? Which is kind of going to be hit and miss, or however people search for things anymore. So I definitely recommend that website. If I'm ever curious if someone's built something, I often always start there because it will give you some ideas of what's already been built.
Well, there's always something new. So yeah, I'm going to
Yeah.
check that out. I didn't know about that. That's cool.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other thing I'll say is that some of the AI programs will go away. I think that we are going to hit that point when they start to sort of fade. So one of the things I posted about today was Gartner, which, studies hype cycles and has been looking at AI. They predicted that more than 30% of those AI programs will go away in the next year. They just aren't going to be financially sustainable. So as you play with AI programs, more than anything else, learn how you learn programs. I think that's actually the big skill. It's going to be less about having, this set of, say, 10 tools that we use, and more about a process for picking them up. That's going to be much more valuable for anyone, for any educator, as these programs come and go and other ones take their place and everything else. But it allows you to kind of use these programs, but not get overly committed to them.
Yeah. Yeah. So how do you figure out these programs? What's your own process?
Yeah.
All right. So last question. I just want to see kind of what kind of services do you offer? Like how can people reach out to you, especially like leadership in colleges, administrators? What kinds of things, when you say you're an AI consultant, what do you do and how can people reach you?
What do consultants do? No one knows.
No one knows.
So a lot of what I do now is keynoting and talking to teachers. I think that a lot of the focus now is how to work AI into the classroom in a way that is responsible. And so I work with quite a few institutions, whether it's in a one and done presentation or it's kind of an ongoing, this is starting to happen now, an ongoing form of support. So as professors are trying to figure out, how can I say, for example, take this assignment and focus on process over product? What does that actually mean? I think that one of the ways that I see my job as a consultant is bridging the gap between an idea and actually doing it, going and doing that thing. It's easy for us to say, oh, process over product. But then you say, all right, well, I'm an architecture professor. What does that even mean? Right? Or like, I'm in this field. What does that mean? I teach biochem. What is process over product? Right. And so once we kind of move around the idea, I think that's where a consultant can kind of come in, give professors and administrators a sense of what pivoting is like, right? What can it mean to make that change, whatever it is. And also another thing I'm doing more is trying to help colleges think about a strategy, think about how to build something. So a lot of colleges, myself included, when ChatGPT came out, the impulse and the first move was to hand things over to a professor to say, figure it out. Have your own policy, have your own, AI policy on your syllabus, talk to students, build your thing. And I think that was good. I think that made sense. But as AI is around longer, we have to make it more sustainable. It's actually really hard to do. And so one of the big things that sort of happened, and is another thing I help colleges with, is, if a professor thought that a student used too much AI or overly relied on it, right? And it gets on detectors and everything else, and they're pretty sure that student cheated. Then what ends up happening is they can approach the student. Maybe they just give the student a 0. And if the student pushes back, that's when things get really unsustainable. And that's what I think has happened, that colleges start to recognize that, say this professor used an AI detector. They're not nearly good enough to hold up in most appeals processes. And so what you end up losing is the relationship between professor and student. So I try to walk institutions through alternatives. I think that there's a desire to have other ways of doing things. And again, it's going to be empathy, right? There are ways that you have these conversations in a way that keep empathy, very much at the table. Just take some practice and then some kind of know-how and just practice, doing it and trying to stick to it as much as we can. So that's a lot of what I do. So working with institutions, kind of ask some of those questions. A lot of what I do is through LinkedIn. And I can give you my email too, but messaging through LinkedIn, I also share as much as I can on there as I'm kind of thinking through this. And I try to be very open with it.
A lot there.
So, for anyone who's interested, definitely check that out. You can send me a message. I try to respond pretty quickly to all of them. But yeah, I'm always looking for new projects. And really, even if it's not a formal project, just reach out to me and I'm more than happy to talk about this stuff. We're all trying to figure things out as we go along. So that's probably the easiest way to get in touch with me.
Okay, great. We'll definitely have your contact information in the show notes, your LinkedIn if you want me to. And if you want me to put your email address, I'll put that out there too.
Cool.
Yeah.
Sounds good.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Jason. This has been a really interesting conversation. It's fun to talk English professor to English professor. And I've enjoyed watching your videos. So you do have a lot of content on there on LinkedIn. So yeah, definitely check it out in the show notes. Now, if you're interested in exploring more about Jason's work and offerings, be sure to check out the show notes. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe. Leave me a message about what you might want to discuss about AI in higher ed. And join me next time. I'm going to be talking to Dr. Kevin Yee. He's from UCF, the University of Central Florida, and he is the co-founder of the Teaching and Learning with AI conference that's held every year there. We're going to discuss the big topic that everyone is concerned about, academic integrity, and that's going to be next month. So until next time, thank you for joining us at AI Goes to College.